Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. I do not remember who told me this, but one time in a class or workshop having something to do with the priestly life, the teacher stood in front of us holding a Bible and said, "This book should come with a warning on the first page that reads, 'Do not attempt this alone.'" Whatever the context of their statement was at the time, what has stayed with me is the wisdom that the teachings within Scripture, teachings I believe that are intended for our human flourishing, for our knowing not just life, but life abundant, are ways of being we can come to not in isolation, but only within relationships, the healthy ones and the ones that need some healing. And in my admittedly biased belief, that includes a relationship with a source greater than myself, from which I grow in understanding the relationships within my very own self. I mean, relationships literally create us. They form our being, and figuratively, they shape our sense of who we are and the narrative framework we use to understand our experiences, explain our choices, and make sense of what is happening consciously and unconsciously. All of it is a relational process. Today, I am speaking with David Kitchings, a licensed professional counselor, i.e. therapist, with a private practice in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he works with individuals and couples. He is a certified internal family systems, or IFS therapist, an approved IFS clinical consultant, and is on staff for IFS trainings and IFIO, Intimacy from the Inside Out, trainings. And you can read more about him and how to find his site in the show notes for this episode. Well, as I listened back to this conversation, one of the notes I jotted down was, why are some of us drawn to professions of unpacking human goodness? I've never uttered that phrase before, but it's definitely one I would use to define my understanding of both a pastor and a therapist, two distinctly different professions to be sure, and yet for me, both offer and support a co-creative process of seeking to understand who we are, especially when we seek to change something about who we are. I want to thank David for making time for this conversation, and I want to add just a few points of info before you listen. At one point, I bring up Carl Jung because I'm seeking to use one of his phrases for what it is we are discussing, and the phrase that I could not remember in that moment is transcendent function. And if that interests you, I trust you will do some of your own investigating. And some of you may not be familiar with what we clearly are familiar with when we reference the Missouri Synod branch of the Lutheran tradition. It's something that comes up when David is graciously sharing from his story. Well, suffice to say, from my experience, it is a particularly conservative branch of the Lutheran tradition. Okay, I hope this conversation is as generative a process of listening for you as it was for me. Thank you for the relational reality you bring to this moment just by being here, and perhaps for expanding that network by sharing this conversation in your world. Let's get started. Thanks again for listening. Hi there, David Kitchings.
Hi.
Thank you so much for making time to be on this podcast. We have not met until this moment, which always has a neat kind of energy to it. And you and I know each other through a mutual friend, your lovely, talented, beautiful wife, Emily Cocaine, who was like an early guest on
That's
this
right.
podcast.
Yes.
And I titled that episode, Connecting All Our Parts, because when I listened to it, we wound up talking a lot about kind of like the internal parts within ourselves and how that connects with what we do and who we are in our story.
Yes. Yeah,
And
that's right.
And then you are somebody who works with people to talk with them.
I do.
So why don't you just say a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Yeah. So first, I'm just delighted to be here and so grateful to get a few minutes to talk with you. So I guess I would say I'm a psychotherapist, and I work primarily, and I work with individuals and couples and occasionally families. Through my work, I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I also do a little bit of executive coaching because of my background, and I'm involved quite a bit with trainings. So I do trainings within internal family systems and the couples model based on internal family systems, which is intimacy from the inside out.
So before I ask you to kind of unpack what some of those phrases and words are, I would love to hear a little bit, and I know we don't have time for the whole of it, but a little bit of the story that propels you to want to be involved in the interior intimacy of another human being who you start out not even meeting until that very first conversation.
Yeah, I always tell people I work with, therapy is so weird because you sit down initially with a perfect stranger and you tell them the most intimate details of your life, some things that you've never told anyone. So that's just kind of odd in a way, but we're actually, I think, called to do that, those of us that do it. And then we also learn how to do that in a way that creates a container to hold what's talked about. So, but for me personally, it's a pretty winding road. I started out in high school, I was like trying to decide what to do. And one of the options was to become a pastor because I was very involved with the church at the time. And I was Lutheran and was considering going to seminary. But I wasn't quite sure I was ready for that sort of lifelong commitment. So I actually went to college as a voice major. So I sing, I play guitar.
I didn't know we have that in common.
Oh, we do we?
Oh my God.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
I went to college as a voice major.
Did you?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. So I started out in that and did it for a little bit. But again, I just don't think I quite had the talent to be a professional musician. And so I switched to psychology and started initially working in inpatient treatment centers. This was back when private insurance first decided, this was back in the 80s, that they would pay for people to go to inpatient treatment. So hospitals started building these really fancy wings. And so I was able to do that. I worked in that a little bit and public mental health. But when I was around the professionals, the social workers, it was just such intensity. And I didn't feel like I had lived enough life to really support people on their journey. And I think I had too much to unpack in my own life from my own upbringing, some things that had happened when I was growing up. So I left and went to law school and became an attorney and moved here to Ohio. That's where I met Emily when we met at a bar, but I was in law school at the time and loved the study of law, but hated the practice of law. It was just so adversarial and bureaucratic. And so I went and got an MBA and worked in business and eventually ran a company with my family and my father. And this whole time, Emily was working for Procter & Gamble. And so we moved to Texas and we eventually sold that business and moved back. And I became a stay-at-home dad to 3 kids. They were 6 months, 2 and 3.5. So it was complete immersion into being a stay-at-home dad after running a company, which really threw me.
I'll bet.
Yeah. So I stayed the primary parent until they were all in school, and I did some music, I did some art. I also sculpted and had a studio. And then we got relocated to Singapore for Emily's job and lived 2.5 years in Singapore. And so when we came back, I was just about to turn 50 and the kids were all in school full time. And then I decided now I'm ready to go back to work. And I went through a year of discernment and I just met with all sorts of people who worked with people. I met with priests, pastors. I met with psychologists. I met with energy healers, shamans. If they touch people's lives in some way, I met with them to try to figure out what I wanted to do. And I had this passion for systems and and organizations, but I also had this passion for working with people. And my background just had a tremendous amount of diversity in it. And so I decided I wanted to really learn how to hold the container around trauma. And I thought to really do that, I wanted to go to grad school. And I had already done a lot of it. So I didn't get a PhD. I went for a master's in counseling, went to Northwestern where they have the Family Institute. And this program is psychodynamic, and it allowed you to start meeting with people right away, which is what I wanted. I wanted to get in the chair and really learn the craft of working with somebody. So I got my master's in counseling. And in the middle of that, we were relocated to Geneva. So we went to Geneva, Switzerland for 5 years. And in Singapore, I had come across internal family systems in my own private journey, but it was professionally in Switzerland with a group of peers where we were doing peer consultation that we watched one of these 6-hour videos Frank Anderson did on internal family systems. So I got introduced to that, and I was actually pretty skeptical about it initially because I bring a lot of skeptical parts to my work, to pretty much anything. But it was just a model I couldn't let go of. It just kept chewing at me. So
what was it you were skeptical of?
Well, I really understood the systemic nature of it, that, we're multiple personalities, that we have different things going on in us, and we're an internal system of parts. But what I did not anticipate or believe is that our internal system would actually communicate back with us. That actually, if you put aside your analytical, cognitive thinking, and you really embodied your system and you started to communicate with it, it would communicate back. That's what was really hard for me to imagine. But I started working with it. I started getting training, and that's exactly what happens.
There's a name of somebody that's coming to mind. It begins with a G. It's not Gestalt, when you say communicate with the system within, what does that mean exactly?
Well, Gestalt does have the empty chair technique. So it is similar. Yeah, that's Gestalt. And it's very similar. But it's like if you have a part of you that, let's say is struggling with a decision, I could actually support you in getting in connection with that part, and then hearing from that part inside of you what's happening for it. So it's a relationship. It's a two-way street of communication. And most therapy there's so many therapies now, so I'm being very general. There's some really different and really beautiful and effective models, but a lot of therapy had been sort of like cognitively reframing what your experience has been. Mm-hmm. And then fortunately, with a lot of the somatic movements, the experiential movements, even psychoanalysis has moved into a relational dynamic. Now there is that internal relationship with the system, and it takes depth psychology to a completely different level. So I just completely dove in with internal family systems, did all the training, started assisting with the trainings myself. And then just a year into that, moved over to the couples side of it as well, working with couples through this lens.
Okay, so I want to ask a little bit about the cognitive reframing.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the ways in which, and I hope this doesn't say anything incorrectly, but I almost think about coaching a little bit like cognitive reframing. And so I'm taking that to mean I will talk about a situation with another person, and they help me see that there are multiple ways in which I can interpret what has happened. And part of that interpretation has to do with who I am, how I'm wired. And then part of it has to do with making a choice to choose other ways of seeing.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. And cognitive reframing is a really important tool in our toolbox of how to have more agency in our lives. The challenge is that when you can't use the tool because there's a deeper wounding or a deeper protective strategy, then the cognitive reframing can almost become problematic because the person can't make the commitment they've made, they can't use the insight they were given. And then they have a little bit of what we call backlash or a feeling of shame that I must be the problem then. And so then they quietly move away from coaching or therapy, not wanting to have to admit I couldn't do what I committed to. So when the person can use the tool, it's amazing and it's really helpful and it's empowering. And also, as you know from coaching, really exquisite questions also take us to a deep level. So those questions are not just reframing to me, they're actually new information.
Mm.
Because what we find is often people are telling us information they already know and they've known for a long time. So unless we can take them to a place where they're learning something new, feeling something new, experiencing something new, then there's a good chance that the pattern that's been in place is just going to continue.
Right. And the challenge I found personally, and then with others, is when you feel something new, it feels wrong because it's new. And one of the things that's helped me in my therapeutic relationship is there has been an incredible building of trust that allows me to trust somebody else telling me, I know it feels hard. I know it feels new. I know it's really difficult.
That's right.
Can you trust me that if you just try it for a little bit, everything won't fall apart?
That's right. Yeah, that's the paradox of therapy and coaching is that somebody comes to you or we go to someone and we really want to shift, we want to change. But then when we start seeing what's going to happen when we start to make that shift and change, the way our relationships with people might shift, the feedback we might get. Systems, they like to stay in homeostasis. They don't like to change, even if it's not good for the system.
That's right.
So when you walk into a system, and we're all involved in systems, whether it's internally or with others, and you start saying, I'm going to do this differently, the system pushes back. And that's scary. And so part of the container of change is that support, is that what I'll sometimes call relational resourcing. That do we have the relationships and the support we need to really empower this new agency that we're taking on?
How long, or did it take you a period of time to understand the therapeutic process in that way, as opposed to, for me, I used to think of it as, I will go to this person, they will fix this problem.
I would say that's an ongoing journey because, any type of personal change is just as much art as science. And it's a co-creative process. And the model that I use really believes that the individual has the internal wisdom in them. They have the drive in them, but we're removing the constraints to that. And so it's a co-creative process on what's actually going to work and what does that look like. And sometimes I'm wondering, is it something that I need to shift in how I'm working with a person? Is it something they want to try differently? Where do we need that catalyst for change? I think of it as alchemy. There's something's got to come in and create that catalyst sometimes. And where is that coming from? Is it coming from me or the person or us together in the relationship?
Jung has a name for that, right? The thing that happens in between people, it's like, and it's not transference, it's not that, it's some, and I don't know, now I'll have to look it up in the show notes or something.
Yeah.
But there's a term, because don't you think there is a third thing that's created?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I believe that because that's part of the balance. We get wounded in relationship and we heal in relationship. And so that relationship becomes an important part of the work. But one of the identifying features of internal family systems is that we are learning to develop a secure attachment inside of ourselves. Initially, that was supposed to come from our caregivers. And some of us got different forms of that. And we developed different attachment styles based on those initial relationships. And then we'll spend a lot of our life just recreating those attachment scenarios, which can be very painful and confusing. How did I get here again? I worked so hard not to, and yet here I am again. And so one of the approaches of internal family systems is we're working to do both. We're developing a secure attachment inside through this relationship with our parts. And from that, we develop a strength to then move back into relationship with the relationships we're in the world and have those relationships be different. And that's where the therapeutic relationship comes in. So I'm always working with a person of when is this a moment for them to be strengthening their own internal system, their emotional container, their ability to sit with discomfort, their ability to manage emotional overwhelm. their ability to step out and really start to speak for needs and maybe even consider what those needs are, to set boundaries. When is that an internal decision? And then when is it between the two of us that something's happening here? We have ourselves dropped into an enactment. And this is a safe relationship where you can practice, where we can talk about it. I'm responsible to hold the space so that we can have a repair if there's a rupture, so that you can practice setting boundaries. When I work with a person and anger starts coming in, I'm really pleased with that, because it means some of that, archetypal energy is allowed to start being in their system. I always see that as a great sign. So it's a both and for me, very much.
That was one of the one of the reasons I wanted to have a therapist on here was to really talk a little bit about what it is, because I came to it with a misunderstanding, I believe, and truly coming to that place of it is the relationship that's doing the healing. And you said it earlier, having the inner strength to express your needs.
That's right.
That is so huge.
It's huge.
It's huge. And simultaneously, I find very much personally and with people I work with in both like pastoral conversations, which are slightly different, obviously, than coaching conversations. On some level, I feel all of us have some degree of resentment when it comes to understanding we are responsible for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, because initially we weren't supposed to be. Initially, we were supposed to be guided and led and supported in learning to be responsible for ourselves in ways that were equivalent to our developmental status at the time, our age, let's say, or where we were in school. And based on so many different reasons, we did not get that. And then we carry this, frustration, resentment, et cetera. And then when we get older, and it really is our responsibility now, we hit that sense of frustration and resentment. And I see it so much in the couples work. Each person is really frustrated at the other and resentful and has a grudge that the other is not meeting their needs. And in ways it's true, but it's not true to the point that it can't be understood, talked about, and managed. And to do that, you have to stop focusing on your partner and you have to focus on yourself, your internal world, and what's happening inside of you. And, that's a delicate balance of someone being challenged to do that, but not being shamed for the time and the care it needs to have the courage to start to do that.
Okay. I have too many questions for the amount of time that there is, and I want to do two things. I do want to ask you, I don't think I knew that you had considered a vocation in ministry. And, we Lutherans and Episcopalians, we're all in full communion now. So we're pretty close.
That's right.
A lot of what we think and feel and believe. What are your thoughts around the way in which we talk about God, think about God, move through our parts of ourselves that are God and that we have a relationship with? And I would just want to hear some of the way you weave together these things.
Well, one of the reasons that I'm able to stay a therapist is because this approach that I use that has been so crafted by internal family systems, but also other models, we have this aspect called self, which means that in each of us is a connection to something bigger. You could call it soul, you could call it spirit, you could call it God, whatever. Each person, it's a different thing. And that we are actually able to unblend, as we would say, from the different parts of ourselves and have access to that greater wisdom, that greater intelligence. And that allows me to bring a spiritual component into my work, whether it's talked about or not. And so different parts of me grew up in the church and took on different beliefs based on what I was taught and the water in which I swam, which, as we know today, was very patriarchal and very supremacist and, colonial, just lots of things that actually tailored a quite limited view of spirituality, of God, of religion. I mean, fortunately for me, and this is just my experience only, Christianity's focus on Christ, I always saw Jesus as a radical revolutionary who took on all of those things, and who, by the way, was not white. You're right, and I had that spirit in me even early in the church. Taking on the pastor, taking on the rigidity of the Missouri Synod.
You were that Lutheran.
That Lutheran, exactly. I mean, my grandmother, my mom's mom, had to go when her husband left her. She had to go apologize to the church so she didn't get excommunicated.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, it's just all that's in there. So unpacking all that and unpacking the beliefs from a very young age of what God is and what's expected in religion and spirituality, that's a long journey, and so many people have been wounded by that. But for me, I also see the Christ story as a story of expanded consciousness, that we're dying and being reborn in our consciousness, and which also means leaving a lot of the old beliefs and things that were taught, and which are still unfortunately very much alive today. And when somebody comes into me and they can bring whatever they bring, I hold this as my own journey, but I can bring the spirituality into my work through that sense of connecting into something larger, a higher intuitive wisdom that we each have. And I do a lot of reading around quantum physics and field theory and all that. And so, I believe that we are both the product of God and the creation that happens, that God is always expanding and unfolding. And I love when I read about, physicists who will not say that they believe in God, but they're like, something is out there. Something is out there. Something is moving this whole thing. I just love when I read that.
I'm reading a book now. I think it's called The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, and it's by Elia Deo, and she's a Roman Catholic theologian. You know her?
I know of her, yes.
Yeah, and really engaged with science and evolution. And she's spending a lot of time talking about love, capital L, God love, is the never-ending force that is evolving all the time and always integrating the next new thing when something dies. And I'm really simplifying it because she also pulls in Teilhard de Chardin and all this other stuff. But that seems to be more and more in the world these days, this connection with that. All right. Okay. That's another tangent. I can't go down. So here's something I want to talk about that I think maybe will take us a little bit too into connecting shame. So
okay, great.
Great. Let's talk about shame. That's fun. So we're in Lent this season, and I started Lent on Ash Wednesday with a conversation with a good friend and colleague, just kind of talking about shame. We talked a lot about John Bradshaw and some themes from Healing the Shame That Binds You. And it has stayed with me. And I found myself when I was preaching this past Sunday on the first story that you always hear in Lent, when Jesus goes into the desert and meets the tempter, Satan, the devil, who gives him these tests. But the story starts with the fact that he spent 40 days there. And then those things happen. And sermons, we tend to focus on the tests, which I have many times. But this time, I couldn't stop thinking about how the fact that before he goes into the desert, the thing that just happened was he was baptized, and God said, "You are my beloved." And I just kept thinking about needing 40 days to be by myself to actually believe maybe that I was God's beloved. And just how that message of value and worth and love that I hear again and again through not just the Christ Jesus story, but all the stories.
That's right.
A lot of the stories of the scriptures. It really, really has a hard time taking hold in most of us. Talk to me a little bit about maybe that.
Yeah, I do believe that love is the answer, that capital L love, and that love so often we can imagine given to others, but we cannot hold for ourselves. And there's just been so many opportunities. There were opportunities when we were younger from many different places to be seen as flawed. I mean, my own religion started with, original sin.
Mm-hmm.
And liturgies today still use language like that, which I just refuse to even repeat if I go into one of those institutions. So when you have this programming, and I speak to you as an entitled, privileged person who has had the least amount of programming thrown at me.
Mm.
But once you move out of that, there is constant programming that there's something wrong with you, that you are flawed in some way. And so the idea of being beloved and feeling that from the inside out, the amount of deprogramming that has to happen, I can see the 40 days as a metaphor.
Yeah.
And what's important is, one of the writers I like to read on shame is Patricia DeYoung. Her definition of shame is, the experience of one's felt sense of self disintegrating in relation to a dysregulating other. And it's viscerally painful.
Yes.
So we can, in a lot of sometimes spiritual bypass, we can go into a sense of enlightenment and meditation, and we're actually in a place where we've disconnected from our bodies and we're not actually feeling the embodied wounding that we carry.
Mm-hmm.
But when you move into a situation where you might experience shame, you have a visceral reaction that disintegrates you. And in therapy, I see therapy as often just two things: shame or grief, ultimately at its core. And our whole protective system is set up to not feel that shame. So when you start moving to it, all sorts of defenses start to come up. Other ways that I might be able to do this without having to possibly feel that shame again. So taking on the idea that you're beloved means getting rid of this idea that you're flawed. And that is just too terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
So we come up with a lot of other strategies to try to feel worthy. And I can sit with incredibly smart, competent people who are just so frustrated and confused of why they keep doing the same thing over and over again, but not being able to go to really hold the pain that shame does to them. Because shame is a verb. Mm-hmm. It's not a noun. Shame is something that happens to us. And when we feel it again, it happens to us again. And so that amount of time needed to really just be with that reality, to feel it, to let it start to get light in the air, as Patricia DeYoung says, to not disintegrate, and then to build from a different place, which is based on our value, our essence.
Yeah.
The gifts we have to bring to the world, the fact that we're human, the grace we need to be present. I can see, that's 40 days. And he went back. He would go back. He had to, and we have to. This is what the world's going to do to us.
Yes.
It's too busy. It's too fast. There's too much all the time. And so that ability to pull back into solitude and reconnect with our worth and our value.
And you need so much patience.
Mm.
And I'm curious about the patience that one needs to have when they're sitting in your chair. Can you say a little bit about that for yourself?
Well, it's so important that I'm not deciding when and where or how the person should be. What I'm putting in is, again, sort of that catalyst, but they are still the product. And they are determining and trusting what's right for them. But at the same time, if they've never been held in that process, they don't know what that looks like. So again, we're back to co-creating. So if I give a push, it's important that the push doesn't feel like you need to be over here. It's actually developing their capacity to determine where they need to be. So if they're trying, that's beautiful. Something will come of that. Even if that next something is finding the next challenge or roadblock that needs to be worked with. which is fine. Then there's movement. And then I hold space for that movement and help them reflect on the movement they're making, which is something we don't often do either, is to celebrate these small steps.
So I want to hear a little bit in the time we have left, which is pretty short. I just want to hear a little bit about how you take care of yourself.
How do I take care of myself? Well, I have my own therapy. I have my own professional consultation. I go and see several different people who support me. Nature is very important to me. And, my spirituality are the different ways that, I take care of me. But I've always been able to handle a certain level of intensity. And so my tolerance for physical pain is not as high, but my tolerance for emotional intensity and spiritual intensity is pretty high.
Yeah, I know what that's like.
Yeah. So sometimes I get just a little exhausted and tired, and I can work too much. I have to be careful. Like, I can work too much and be in front of people too much. But really, nature would probably be the biggest thing for me. Just being out in that but it's always something I'll have to pay attention to. I think any of us that work in this field, I think COVID really ramped up the amount of people willing to go seek help, which is great, although it was an unfortunate circumstance.
Yeah.
I think social media, like kids today, are much more versed in it. They're much more comfortable getting a therapist, which I think is fantastic. But it does mean, like, all of my friends and colleagues are full.
Everybody's full.
With waiting lists, and I get it. Well, who then can I see? Please give me a name. So yeah, there's a lot of need out there.
There is. Well, I know that somebody, many more than just one person, actually, because that would be me plus one, have benefited from this conversation with you. And David, I certainly hope it's not the last conversation you and I.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's been really, really great. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you.